Good morning. I see Linda is here early. Good. Glad to see you guys joining us. If you can, let me know in the comments where you're from and why you're joining us. I'm excited to share my travel experiences with you again this morning. We skipped a week last week because Rebecca and I were traveling. We were moving from Tucson to Phoenix. We're just kind of transients right now, waiting out the winter time and the COVID mess. So we're in Phoenix right now, probably for a month, and then I don't know exactly what's happening next. It could be a surprise for all of us. So today's topic is on independent travel, or sometimes I call it DIY, do-it-yourself travel. And this is one of the aspects of travel that I really enjoy, and I think that everybody can find their place on the continuum that is independent travel, and I'm going to talk about that, and make your traveling experiences more authentic and more adventurous. So again, if you're out there, let me know why you're joining in today. I know that there's some folks maybe from the UK that have joined us. Annie may be out there and she hasn't said hi yet, but I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. All through the presentation, you can ask me questions. There is a delay of about 10 seconds or something like that between when I actually broadcast and you see it. So when I won't see your questions right away, but I will answer them as soon as I see them. And if I forget, I'm going to try to remember to go back to them at the end and be sure I get everybody. So let me start out. I'll tell you what we're going to do today. Like I said, today is independent travel. And the main things that I'm going to cover today are I'm going to talk about a little bit about what I feel like independent travel is, and then I'm going to go, as usual, go over the advantages and disadvantages of independent travel. I'm going to give you some tips for figuring out if independent travel is the right thing for you, and also some tips for starting out on becoming an independent traveler and overcoming some of your apprehensions. I'll talk a little bit about why I don't do escorted tours or all-inclusive tours, but then I will tell you how sometimes I take advantage of guided excursions. And I'll kind of insert here that I feel like everything in life, there is a continuum. There's like all the way over to, way over here, there's like escorted tours. Everything is done for you. Your luggage is taken to the room. All your meals are provided for you. You have a guide every step of the way. There's no way you're going to get lost. All the way over here to where you're completely off the beaten track and you're doing everything for yourself. But there's a continuum. Like, you don't have to do all or none. You can find a place somewhere on there, and I am somewhere in the middle as far as what works for you, what you enjoy doing, what is valuable for you. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. And all the way through this, keep that in mind, that everything that I do, you don't have to do. And you might want to take it a step further and become more adventurous. I don't know, if Annie, are you there? You said you were joining us. I'm looking forward to, if you're there, say hi, because Annie in the UK is a good friend of mine, and she's done a lot. She's been traveling independently all of her life, and she could maybe throw in some tips along the way in the comments because she knows, I think she's a much more professional independent traveler than I am. And in the end, I'm going to give you a bunch of resources so that you can start working on planning your own independent travel experience. So what is independent travel? And this is my definitions. Everybody's going to have their own. Most independent travelers like to choose their own destinations and itineraries based on their own interests. They like to do most or all of their own travel research. They don't depend on agencies very often. They tend to travel alone or with a very limited number of like-minded people so that they can kind of hone in on those experiences that are of interest to them. Most independent travelers really like to engage with locals and experience the local culture. And one thing that I especially like about independent travel as opposed to guided tours is that independent travelers often like to stay in one location a lot longer than most guided tours will allow. Guided tours are kind of maybe 2 or 3 days in one location most of the time, depending on the kind of tour it is. And so guided, if you do your own tours, your own travel, then you can decide how long you want to stay in any given place. And I want to talk a little bit about that too. And most people who are independent travelers enjoy finding off the beaten track places to go. Let's see if my next. Yes. For example, this gorgeous downhill walk from Chinchero in Peru down to the Urubamba River, which is in the Sacred Valley. I hiked this, and the Sacred Valley is very touristy. There are so many tourists there because that's kind of the route, or the route up to the people are going to Machu Picchu, and a lot of the ancient ruins are in this area, and there's a lot of wonderful Quechua culture in this area, and so it's a very touristy area. But I did not meet one other tourist on this trail, and in fact, we really almost didn't meet anybody. I was with one other woman, and it is just right in the heart of the Sacred Valley, but nobody knows about it. It was really a wonderful, beautiful trip, following this water all the way down the valley down to the Urubamba River. So you can find off the beaten track places right in the middle of tourism. So it is possible to do that. Let's see. And one more thing that independent travelers like is to kind of live locally, which, in other words, using public transportation, using local stores, getting to know people in the markets and in the cafes, that kind of thing, feeling more like they're learning more about the local culture as they travel. Independent travelers tend to be less interested in sightseeing and more interested in getting to know the people and the culture. And that, again, is a continuum. Some people really go some places to see certain sites, and it's very important to them. So it depends on what your interest is, because oftentimes if your interest is more along the lines of history, you may be more interested in the sites than I am. I'm more interested in interacting. So, but you can choose what facets of travel you want to engage in, and that is the wonderful thing about independent travel. And like I said earlier, we only hire guides or go on guided excursions occasionally. And I'll talk quite a bit about that in a bit. So, and like I said, go ahead and put your questions or comments in as we go. So now I'm going to talk about the advantages of independent travel, and I've mentioned those earlier. One is you get to go where and when you want to go. With tours, you pretty much have to stick with the schedule and the group. And even when the place or activity that you're engaged in with the group is boring, or if the restaurant isn't very good, you don't have a lot of choice about where you go or what you do, and that is constraining. So that is an advantage of when you're independent. You get to change plans on a whim. When you feel a special attraction to a location, you can decide to stay longer. On the other hand, if you're disappointed in a location or experience, you can quit and leave. I'm not having any fun, let's go move on, and go on to something that you enjoy more. And a lot of times this is in the constraints of how much time you have to travel and when you have to be back on the plane, but this is, there are some advantages when you can have a lot more flexibility. You have more opportunity to make lasting friendships with locals and with other travelers. I will mention here, I'm not going to talk really about solo travel in this presentation, But I will say that it helps if you're it's also another thing that helps with meeting local people is when you're traveling solo or maybe with just one other person. The more people you have in your travel group, the less you're going to pay attention to people and activities outside of your local, what you're doing with your group that you're with. So that's my pitch for solo travel, and I'll do a presentation on that sometime in the future. You definitely can save money as an independent traveler. You can always spend more money as an independent traveler, but I have found that with careful planning, and you guys know, if you guys that know me know how cheap I am, but I've learned that with careful planning, independent travel can be much cheaper than escorted tours. For example, I traveled for less than $40 a day for 3.5 months in Peru, and that included my airfare from the United States to Lima and return. That's $4,200 I spent, more más o menos, for 3.5 months. Now, I challenge you to live in the United States for $4,200. That was everything. The guided excursions that I went on a few times, all my bus fares, gifts that I bought, everything, $4,200. So you can, and I was comfortable. So you can do it, save a lot of money as an independent traveler, which means you can travel more often. You can travel more slowly. I mentioned earlier, oftentimes we like to spend time savoring one place as opposed to moving around and hopping from, like the old saying goes, 7 countries in 5 days in Europe, It's like you barely even get a smell of the country before you move on to the next one. So one thing independent travelers do is you're able to move more slowly. On an escorted tour, you're always faced with deadlines. Be ready to leave by 8 o'clock in the morning, have your luggage outside your door. If you have until 2 o'clock to visit the museum on your own and then be back on the bus, the bus will be leaving at 2 o'clock. So it's like you really have to pay attention, and it's nice to be able to just spend as much time as you want to wherever you are. You have an opportunity to get lost as an independent traveler. I call that an opportunity because you can just strike out and take a walk away from the main streets, away from the tourism areas, and you never know what kind of jewels you're going to find that way. Like here, I just started walking away from the main streets in Porto, in Portugal, and I came across this really cool cemetery that I ended up spending about an hour just walking through. It looked like a little tiny city with all with the family mausoleums with names on them, and there were actually streets. There was a street map at the beginning of the cemetery, and it was really interesting because I'd never seen anything like that. And in the background, occasionally those church bells in that foggy background would toll, and it was I felt like I'd moved to a different planet or something. When you're an independent traveler, it's easy to take a day off from traveling. If you become ill or just want to relax a little bit, you can do it. If you're on an escorted tour and you take a day off, you're gonna miss something. You're gonna probably miss a lot because those escorted tours have you do a lot of things every day. And so the nice thing is if you just go, I just don't want to go anywhere. I don't want to do anything. I want to sit by the pool, or I want to, just sit and write up in my journal, whatever. You can take a day or a few hours off and do that, and you're not going to miss anything. So these are the advantages, but I will say that I know that sounds maybe a little idyllic for some people, but there are downsides, and I'm going to talk about the disadvantages. You do have to make all of your own travel arrangements, and this can mean, let's see if I can get to that. And this can mean spending hours on the computer looking at train schedules, bus schedules, flights, deciding which is the best lodging choice, where you're going to save the most money. And if you're not a professional travel agent, it's easy to make a mistake in the arrangements and not find out about them until it's too late. And so it can be a little bit stressful and challenging to do that. The more you do it, the better you get at it, I will say, just like anything. There's sometimes when you will spend time making travel arrangements, maybe several hours, and at the end you just can't figure out how to make that last connection work. The bus only runs 3 days a week, and you just can't get to the place where you catch that bus, that kind of thing. And it can be real frustrating. And so then you just have to start over from square one or plan something completely different. And that's happened to me a few times. And I ended up not being able to go a few of the places that I wanted to, mostly because I don't drive when I'm in other countries. And so I don't want to rent a car. A lot of times you can get over some of these problems if you rent a car. But I'm a little bit of a tentative driver in other countries, so I don't do so. But sometimes it's challenging to make all the plans work out. There are language issues. You don't have a translator right in your pocket that you do when you have an escorted guide. So that's a problem. And you don't have a convenient guide to answer your questions. You can't just turn to a person right next to you or right in your group that's a local guide and ask questions as they come up. As a result, you're going to miss out on kind of maybe getting key details answered at the location or during the experience. But if you write down some of those questions that are important or you really want to know the answer to, and when you get back to your guest house or your lodging, the local hosts are usually really happy to explain things to you. So just, if you see something that you don't understand or, why do they do things? I had a funny experience in Peru. I was sitting on the corner watching a local carnival happening with the Quechua people in this little tiny village, and they were parading around the plaza, and then they would take a break, and they would all just sit around right in the plaza, and they would be drinking beer. And when they drink beer, they have one big bottle, and they pass it around with a glass. And so when they would pour the beer in the glass, and then they would drink it, and then they would pour what was remaining on the ground, and then they would pass the both over to the next person. And so I thought that they were kind of giving a offering to the Pachamama, and I thought that was really cool. But I thought it was kind of interesting because usually offerings are done first. So I was really a little confused. So I got back to my guest house and I was asking about that, and they just laughed and they said, no, no, no. They were just putting out the espuma, the foam. They were pouring out the foam out of the cup before they passed it on. So there was nothing spiritual about it. It was just very practical. So it's always worthwhile asking questions when you aren't really sure you understand something. The next thing that is a disadvantage is that you may not be able to visit quite as many places. Guided and escorted tours are out there so that they can you can get as much bang for your buck. You can see as many places as possible, and that they kind of find the lowest common denominator, the thing that's common most people are going to want to see or experience, and they're going to do all those things. So if you do things on your own, you have trouble. You're going to end up traveling a little more slowly, taking a little more time. You can't do so much of a whirlwind, which to me is an advantage. But you're not going to be able to get as many places as quickly because you don't have your own bus to get you there, unless you have quite a bit of money. So those are the advantages and disadvantages that I can list. Maybe Annie could throw in some more. If you think of anything, Annie, throw it out there. And I don't know if Nev is here. Sometimes Nev joins us from the UK. He's another very experienced independent traveler. I would love to have your comments as well. So how do you decide if independent travel is for you, and how much of independent travel do you really want to partake in? Some questions to ask yourself. Do you enjoy researching your travel plans on your own, even if sometimes it might take a couple of hours or more, or maybe it may be over a period of days? I often have to do some planning, doing some research, think about it a little bit, go back, do some more research, and then before I actually finalize all of my plans. So it's not a really, it isn't always a real quick thing to do. Is for you, is planning the trip almost as much fun as the trip itself? I see travel planning as a puzzle that's kind of enjoyable to do. if you find it very tedious and you don't like that kind of thing, you might want to get help, or you just maybe just need a little more experience and keep plugging at it. But some people, they don't like it. They don't like the challenges, the stresses that are involved. And so, and you don't know that until you try it out and practice it a little bit. Are you good at reading and following instructions? That's pretty important. If you leave things out, or you miss something in the planning process, or little notes you might find out. I know when I was traveling from Spain to Utrecht in the Netherlands, I had 4 trains to travel on to do that. And I had a major connection in Paris, in which I had to go transfer train stations. I had to get on the metro and go over to the other train station in order to catch the next train north. And there was construction there. Well, luckily, in my planning process, I had found a little bit of I had found a notation saying there's currently construction going on the metro. Here's the way around it. There were some very detailed instructions, but as a result, in the hour and a half that I had for that connection, I easily made my connection. But it was really important that I saw those instructions and I read them, and they were a little bit complex, but I figured it out, and I made it because I had to do an extra transfer in the metro tunnels and get to my train. And so it's pretty important that you read all of the details when you get tickets and when you are doing your research. Are you comfortable reading and using a map? Of course, these days it's a little bit easier than it used to be because we have Google Maps, and that little blue dot shows us where we are. But you need to be able to read a map so that you can keep track of where you're going and where you are. Next one is a big one. When things don't go as expected, it's a good idea to think about what is your response. Are you flexible? Is it hard to calm down? Are you quick to consider options? Do you let things kind of get you down? It may be challenging for you to travel independently, because I want to tell you, things aren't always going to go as expected. And that's one of the exciting things about traveling independently, is you don't know what to expect. In fact, when I first started my trip, my trip from 3 years ago, I called it Expecting the Unexpected, because I really had no idea what I was going to encounter a lot of the places that I went. So that's kind of a pro and a con, but keep in mind, sometimes when I'm in the middle of something that's got me all flustered and frustrated or angry, I have to keep in mind this isn't going to make a really good story, because usually those are the best stories, are when things are not going so well. The next thing is it easy, and this kind of tied into the previous item, is it easy for you to think outside the box and come up with contingency plans either during the planning stage or when things are going awry? So that's a couple of skills that are really valuable when you're traveling independently. So let's see, what was I doing? Oh, if you have access to my blog, if you access my blog post, my blog on Cathleen's Odyssey, I have a post about a lot of what I'm talking about here, independent travel. It's called Do It Yourself Travel. And you will see that there's a worksheet there that you can access that will help you decide if independent travel is the right thing for you and help you with the initial planning process. And I'm going to put all of the links that I mentioned today, I'm going to put them in the notes on the YouTube video this afternoon, so you will have them available. All right, I'm going to give you a few tips for becoming an independent traveler. It's important that at first you keep things simple and comfortable. I oftentimes tell people start out in a country or an area where you've been before, or that has a culture or a language that's similar to your own. For people in North America, going to Europe is very nice because so many people speak English. And the culture is close to ours. You're still going to have a few things that are different, but it's a good way to start. Last year, when I started my trip in Europe, I was 13 months in Europe. And by the time I finished, I was like, I saw this blog post. That basically said, you need to go to Kyrgyzstan. And I was ready. I was comfortable with traveling. I was comfortable with a lot of new foods and new cultures and language issues. And so I did. I said, oh, I'm not going to go back home to the U.S. I'm going to Kyrgyzstan. And I did. So if you start out something that's easy for you to travel at first, it's easier to kind of take the next step. If you have friends at your destination, you can ask for their advice about places to go and visit, or maybe you can even go stay with them and they'll show you around. Depends on how good of friends you are, so that you can get familiar with the culture. If you're thinking about going on an escorted tour, but you would like to do some independent travel, I suggest sometimes that you combine the two. Schedule your escorted tour, go on it, say it's 10 days in the country, but don't fly back home immediately. Schedule 3 or 4 or 5 days after the tour, or however much time you have available to you, and stay there. And maybe find a more local hotel. Usually escorted tours have really nice, you're staying in really nice kind of touristy hotels. Try staying in a guest house. And then ask your guide before you leave the tour or the tour's over what his or her recommendations are for you to see. Or you can say, you know, I really am thinking about going back and visiting that potter's studio because I'm really interested in pottery or ceramics. And can you give me some suggestions about where I might stay in that village, or who I might visit, or how I can learn more about that? Because those guides are always very helpful, and they're very knowledgeable. If they're good, they're very knowledgeable, and you can pick their brains before you leave, before the tour is over. And then stay the few extra days and do some of the things. Go back to some of the places that were really interesting. Go do the things that weren't included in the tour, because now you're a little more comfortable with the country. You've learned about a lot, hopefully, from the tour. You've learned a lot about the culture and the language and places to go. And so then you can, that's a step out of the escorted tour to begin independent travel. Of course, it's important, research, research, research. You want to Google the hell out of your location. For example, I recently Googled Guanajuato in Mexico, and I found a plethora of blog posts and videos about it. I'd never heard of Guanajuato until then, and I found, though, that although there's all these blog posts about it, that it is actually a fairly non-touristy town to visit. It's not completely off the beaten track, but it's not Oaxaca or Puerto Vallarta. It is more of a village where you can experience local things. And you can see I found so many things just right off the bat. I found a lot of information about Guanajuato just Googling it. So use Google. And in a minute, in some of the resources, I'll show you where you can find more information and more help for doing your planning. I suggest booking a homestay early on usually I use Airbnb. I have some issues with Airbnb, but there's nothing out there really that does exactly the same thing Airbnb and does it as well as they do. You want to look for places where you can rent a room in a family home, or maybe a room that's near the family or the host, so the host is nearby, because that way you have the host available to ask them questions. And also you want to read the reviews and be sure that people say that the host is very helpful. This was my first Airbnb stay ever. It was when I was going to Peru the first time. I was going to Arequipa, and Adela and Manuel were my hosts. And actually, this is in their guest house is where Annie and I met. And when I arrived in Arequipa, and I was very nervous, it was my first time traveling in 40 years outside the United States. Manuel met me at the bus station, and he took me home in a taxi. And then later that day, after I'd kind of gotten over my jet lag, he took me to the main center of town and showed me around so that I knew where things were and how to get to the main center of town from their guest house and back, and so that I wouldn't get lost. And this is really a helpful host, and he does that with everyone that comes to visit. So, and I knew that he was going to be that helpful because I read the reviews about them first. And so you can read the reviews and find out, people will point out, oh, they are the most helpful people, the most friendly, helpful, really nice place to stay. So Airbnbs are a great place, and you can start to move into that area of living locally when you are living in an Airbnb and renting a room. Oftentimes, most of the time, they also feed you breakfast, and Adela made some wonderful big breakfasts for us. So I have a question Linda has. I'm not ignoring the questions, but here they are. Linda asked me, how do I get access to the funds as I travel, and do I basically use cash machines? And that's what I do. Cash machines I found all over the world. Even on a really small island I was in on Indonesia, there were cash machines, especially any place where there's very many tourists around. The only place I had a problem with it was in India, because I was in a village where there weren't as many tourists, and the cash machines were tending to be a little bit iffy. But as soon as I hit the country, I get cash out of the cash machine in the airport, and I get plenty to last me for a few days, so I don't have to deal with finding the best cash machines. But once you're in the country, I always also look for cash machines that aren't going to charge me. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. But yes, I use cash machines to get cash. It's very easy nowadays. It's very easy. So let's see, let's go back to tips. I'm going to talk also, if you ask locals for recommendations, you will get a lot of recommendations. Tell especially your host what kinds of things you're interested in. Sometimes I will do this in advance. For example, Becca and I were planning to go to Morocco, and we rented a room in advance through Airbnb with a local host that lived there in the town and was very familiar with the town. And then we wrote a detailed letter to the host telling him what our interests were, because we're very interested in foods and local markets, and what kinds of things we wanted to experience. And he wrote me a really long letter back with lots of suggestions, telling me that his wife can help me with this, or he knew this person that could help us with translations, blah, blah, blah. He just gave us so much good information, because that's the kind of people you will find on Airbnb. They're very, very helpful. It was really just too bad that COVID forced us to cancel that trip. But I still got the guy in my back pocket when I get ready to travel again. So it's perfectly normal for you to be nervous about reaching out on your own, and I've been there. I've been nervous about things. In a little bit I'll give you a blog post you can read about that. But I think it's important for us to keep in mind that our fears are mostly illusions. What's scary for one person is exciting or perfectly normal for another. For example, how many of us get into our automobiles and regularly drive down the freeway? That's probably one of the most dangerous things most of us do in our lives. And I still have fears when I travel, but the alternative is basically not to travel. So you maybe sometimes, because I don't drive much anymore, as much as I used to, now I've developed this kind of fear of getting on the freeway. I have to make myself, okay, it's okay, you can merge, you know how. But I used to never have a problem with that. So our fears can be mostly illusions, and you can kind of train yourself to get over them to a certain degree. And there's things you can do. Oh, I see Annie left. Let me backtrack just a little bit. Annie left a comment. I am trying to watch your comments, Annie. And she wants me to mention couch surfing. I have never done couch surfing yet. I'm going to one of these days, but I haven't yet. And I I will say that, but Annie's done a lot of couch surfing. And if you go to couchsurfing.com, and I will put that in the notes, you will find that you can, for free, be able to go and stay in somebody's house. And sometimes it's on their couch, sometimes they have a whole bed. There's some people that have done couch surfing and found out they had a whole guest house to themselves, and it's always free. And it's a great way to interact, usually with the locals who are really interested in having travelers and meeting people. Oftentimes they also want to practice their English or whatever language you speak. And so it's a good way to meet people, couch surfing, and it's couchsurfing.com. I'll put it in the notes. But Annie has done couch surfing and has found it to be a wonderful way to meet local people. All right, let's go back to apprehensions. I think apprehensions, my couch surfing sometimes has a little, the reason I haven't done couch surfing may be because I have some apprehensions about it. We'll find out one of these days. I'm going to try it out. There's some things you can do to deal with your apprehensions. One is you can ask a local for recommendations of areas, and they can tell you areas they consider unsafe, and they can also tell you places that are good to go. Like instead of going to the touristy market, my friend Adela in Arequipa took me down to the market that she uses, and there wasn't a tourist in sight. So you will get some good recommendations that way. Do your research in advance. I can't mention research enough. I personally, and he's probably going to laugh at this, I personally make really detailed plans for when I arrive in a new country, especially if it's a country that I'm not sure, that's a little bit outside my comfort zone. I did this when I went to Kyrgyzstan. The more knowledgeable you are about the place that you're going, the more comfortable you're going to be when you arrive. So like when I'm going to a completely new country, and this happens to be when this is the plan I made when I arrived in Bishkek, I'll map out everything I expect to happen from the time I leave the plane or the train or however I'm arriving, and I know exactly where to meet the bus that'll take me to my hostel or my guest house. I mark exactly where the hostel is on my Google Maps. I try to see where the bus is going to leave me off so I'll know where to walk. Or I research the taxi system and see how it works at the airport, for example. Most airports and some train stations have a taxi kiosk so that you're assured to get onto a taxi that is a legitimate taxi. So I don't worry about being scammed or cheated by taxi drivers, which is something that happens in some places. But I really researched the hell out of my arrival. And Annie's really going to laugh at this because this is going to sound really extreme, but sometimes I even use Google Maps Street View for the areas where I'm going to be walking when I get there. So for example, this is where I was going to get, I looked and see where I was going to get dropped off on the bus so that when I got off of the bus, I knew exactly what the landmarks looked like, and I knew which direction to start walking so I could step off the bus and start walking with confidence toward my hostel, and I would look like I knew what I was doing. And then if I could go a couple of blocks, maybe if I needed to look at the map, then at least I wasn't just getting off of the bus. I didn't look like some noob, and it wasn't likely that somebody was going to necessarily, you know, just come up to the bus and try to get me to come stay at their hostel or try to get me to do anything else other than what I wanted to do. So it really helps me to do that, and it does help me feel more comfortable as I'm arriving. And again, I think it's important to take things step by step. If you want some inspiration about going step by step, I would read here's my travel blog about when I was really scared when I first arrived in Peru. It's called "A Ship in the Harbor is Safe." The rest of that quote is, "But that's not what ships were built for." And I try to keep that in mind whenever I am a little bit nervous. But this blog talks about how I was scared to walk out of my guest house when I first arrived. A few weeks later, I planned my own trip to an excursion to Lake Titicaca from Arequipa for a week on my own, all my own reservations. So I went from being scared of walking out of my guest house when I arrived in Arequipa to planning my first excursion all on my own in a country where I knew very little of the language. And it was a phenomenal first excursion. So you can take those steps one by one as you go. Another thing you can do is ask yourself what's the worst that can happen. Now, yeah, the volcano can erupt, but is it really likely? Be reasonable about what you think, what's the worst that can happen. For example, if I get on a bus and I end up completely lost, I can always find a taxi to take me back to my lodgings. So what's the worst that can happen when I get on a bus? I could get completely lost. I could get on a taxi and say, there's the address for my lodgings, take me home. And so it helps to say what's the worst that can happen. And sometimes the worst that can happen is, yeah, the bungee cord could break when you take that dive. But is it reasonable? Try to stay in the real world in your apprehensions. So, let's see, I'm watching. I'm watching for Annie's questions. I have to go someplace else to see them. So here we go. All right. So our next topic. All right. Our next topic is. So what about Kathy? What is your problem with escorted tours? Okay, I've already talked about how I usually don't use escorted tours or join a package tour. From the very beginning, I've stayed away from these tours because they are very pricey. They tend to cost a lot of money, and they're usually providing lodging and meals that I consider expensive. They go places that I don't necessarily want to go. They include admissions to places that I have no interest in, and then I look at the itinerary, and then they're not going to one place that I really want to go. So that is probably my biggest problem because I'm so cheap. I don't want to pay those hefty costs. And there's also usually several middlemen that each are going to get a cut of your fare. When I travel independently, most of my money goes right into the hands of the local economy, which is really important. And it's going to be very, very important as we come out of COVID and we start traveling again. These economies are broken. I have friends in Sri Lanka who are hungry that have depended on the tourism industry their entire lives. I'm anxious to get back there so I can start taking some of my Social Security money and putting it into their economy. That's going to help them a lot. When you're on an escorted tour, you have very little opportunity to interact with local people, which is one of the main reasons I travel, as I've mentioned. You also have little control over your schedule. For example, I did, and I'm going to talk a little bit about taking an excursion in a little bit, but I did take a one-day excursion to the northern coast of Northern Ireland, and it is beautiful up there. And I could have explored this whole wild coast for a whole day. I could have hiked all day and maybe gone another day and hiked some more. But alas, I had taken a guided excursion from Belfast for the day, and we had to be back on the bus in an hour. I got to walk a little bit, but I didn't get to do nearly as much as I would have wanted to. It was beautiful. So here's when I use escorted tours. One thing is they have to be well recommended by locals that have used them. I had a friend who lived in Peru who gave me the contact information of a local guide agency who I used when I wanted to go to the jungle. And I had a wonderful experience because he knew which agency to recommend. You can also read blog posts and reviews, but you want to get something that you know is going to be high quality for your money. Another thing that I do quite frequently is I go on city walking tours just to orient myself, kind of get a basic idea of what the city is about, a little history of the city, and then I have a guide that I can ask on the walking tour, ask a few questions that maybe I have about the city, that maybe it's not covered in the tour, but the guides are always happy to answer. Oftentimes, in many cities, there's free walking tours that you can find out about at the tourist office. And what these are, usually it's often college students or just people that like to have interact with tourists and are knowledgeable about their city. And they only charge tips at the end of the tour. You just pay what you think the tour was worth to the guide, and the tips go directly to the guide. And the nice thing about that is that the guide is going to work really hard to give you a good tour so that they will get good tips. One of those walking tours that I took was in Edinburgh, Scotland. I took a Harry Potter tour of the city. It was phenomenal. It was completely free. You didn't have to pay, but I want to tell you, at the end of that tour, people were dumping tons and tons of money into that woman's tip bag because she had done such a wonderful job. And I did too. And it's really wonderful because if it isn't any good, you can just walk away. You haven't spent any money in advance and you don't feel committed to staying with the group. So look for these free walking tours. You'll find them all over the world. I like these tours, these escorted tours, to be short, so I'm not committed for several, like 10 days or something like that. That's a long time. I appreciate it when they are usually in small groups. So here's a few examples of when I have used escorted tours. So like I say, I'm not way on the other end where, I don't take part in any kind of pre-planned activities. I do this. So if there's a specific theme or subject that I'm interested in, for example, this was a 2-day tour that took me into the coffee to 2 farms, organic farms in Peru. One was a coffee and one was a cacao farm, and talked about how these plants are farmed. And we got to make our own chocolate paste from scratch, and we got to make our own coffee that we had for breakfast the next day. And it was from actually everything from picking the bean all the way through the whole process. So it was quite interesting. And it was also a very small group. There were only 5 of us in that tour. And it was a challenge. It was going to be a challenge for me to get to these places. And that was another thing, was that they provided the transportation for us. When the going gets tough, sometimes I use a tour guide. My daughter and I did this trip this was an example of the toughness. We walked for 4 days into and out of the canyon in Choco to visit the ruins of Choqquequirao in Peru. This was it was a high altitude and very steep climbs. And so this tour agency would provide horses, our meals, set up our tents, and it was very welcome because for us, it was exhausting. For the people that live there, they just run up and down these hills. But for us, it was very tiring, and it was great to have a guide when we got to the ruins. In this tour, there was only 4 of us, plus the guide, and a couple of horsemen and the cook, and we had great meals. So that was a great thing. It was a little pricey, but it was worth it, and it's one of the most memorable things that I've ever done. If I want language translation, sometimes I will hire a guide. In this case, this was the animal market in Bishkek in Kyrgyzstan. I wanted to go visit, but it was completely a local market. There was no tourists there. There was no tourism. There were no guides. So I hired a young man who was a college student who spoke English, and he actually said, yes, I would love to take you. My brothers actually will have some cattle there at the animal market that happens every week. And he was he didn't know that much about the animal market. And so I wasn't paying for like a guide to the animal market. I was just paying for a translator. And it was very helpful to have him help me ask questions of people that I met there. If there's no other way to visit a place that I really want to go, then I will hire. I will go on a tour. And this was when I went to the jungle. In this area of the jungle in Peru, you cannot go to unless you have a guide, a certified guide. This is so that they can protect the jungle and the people who live there. And this was a wonderful tour. It was 4 days. There were only about 6 of us, I think. I booked the tour locally, and I had a wonderful naturalist guide, and it was a great experience. So more about this can be you can learn about in a blog post. And again, I'll put all these at the bottom of the notes when I get done here. But you can read about the pros and cons of escorted tours here on this blog post. Oh, and then if you want to read about when I ditched a tour one time that I was on an escorted tour back in the 70s. I ditched the tour, and you can check out my blog post about how I got lost in the old city of Jerusalem. But I had a story to tell at the end. Oh, Annie wrote, Annie gave me something to tell you that I hadn't thought about regarding bank cards. You can lose your bank card. I've lost mine. Apparently Annie has lost hers, but usually it doesn't put you out too much. One thing I do is I usually have 2 bank cards. And I usually just carry one of them on me at a time. I leave the other one back at my lodgings in a safe place. Usually there's places you can lock things up. But I only carry one with me so that if I do lose it, I will have my backup card to use until I can get a replacement for the main card that I use. I did lose my card in Copenhagen because I very stupidly, I think I left it in a machine. I'm not sure what happened with that card. But anyway, I was able to contact my banker. It is a Visa travel card, and so therefore I said, you can't send this card to my home address, I won't be there. And they FedExed it to me, and I got it. And when I got to Estonia, it was only about a week that I was without it. So it was not a big deal, but you do kind of panic anytime you lose your credit card. But if it happens, there are solutions. Just keep calm and think about what the solutions are. So back to resources. I've mentioned quite a few already, but in the blog posts, those are all resources that I've mentioned. There is a blog post called Do It Yourself Travel that covers a lot of what I've said in this video, but without quite so many stories. And that's where you'll find that worksheet to help you start planning independent travel. There is another blog post, a couple of blog posts that I wrote that really specifically show step by step my method for traveling to the next destination. And this is, I've had several times people say, basically, can I look over your shoulder while you make your reservations? And I just watch what you do on the screen because I want to see how to do this. So basically, Movin On, this blog post is you looking over my shoulder with me telling you instructions, showing you what I'm doing for planning. And then another post that goes along with it is one that's called Trip Planning Technique. It's basically me applying all the stuff that's in the previous blog post to an actual journey that I took that was a multi-train journey, my multi-train journey that I went from Spain up to Utrecht. So you can see exactly how I use these techniques and all of my recommendations for resources for doing travel, finding itineraries, and actually making reservations. I have written a lot of how-to blog posts, and you can find them here at Cathleen'sOdyssey.com/travel-how-tos, and you probably will find more information about different aspects of traveling independently, solo, cheaply. I'm a very cheap traveler, so there's lots of ideas there. So I will say that becoming an independent traveler can be really challenging at first, but the rewards are really worth it. Keep in mind, it's a step-by-step process. It is a continuum. The more you travel independently, the more independent and adventurous you will become. I know that from experience. And I just say, I think it's important to remember my motto that life begins at the end of your comfort zone. Kind of exciting that comfort zone boundary keeps moving, and we will keep moving toward it and keep finding more and more adventurous things to do. Let me know if you have any questions yourself. And let me see what I have next coming up. see. Okay, thanks, Annie. She's just giving me a high five. So I'm glad you think so, Annie, because as I said, I think Annie is a really experienced traveler. One of these days, I may interview you, Annie, here on my live broadcast, because we need to pick your brain. You're a very experienced traveler. So I'll talk a little bit now about my next Facebook event. Next week on Sunday, I will be talking about hostels. I've been seeing a lot of questions about hostels on a Facebook group I've been following called Girls Love Travel. And so I thought, well, I'll do something about hostels. And I have found in my traveling that hostels are really not just for youth. A lot of them are dropping the name youth because they're not for young people anymore necessarily. I see a lot of people that are a lot older than 20-something. So I'm going to be talking about that next week. During my 2-year journey, I slept in 96 different hostels. So I'm getting pretty good about finding which hostels work for me and the ones that are right for me, because they can vary. Again, you have a continuum of hostels to choose from. So, and again, like I say, they're not for 20-something, just for 20-somethings anymore. Believe me, there's a lot of older people, more than 20, that are there. So, speaking of topics, the topics that I choose for these live presentations depends on you. I can talk about anything that I am knowledgeable about, that you would like for me to. If you think of something you would like to know more about, please let me know. You can message me, you can comment to me, you can send me an email through my website, and you can see on my website, I can put that up here. You can see on my website most of the places that I have visited. If you would like stories, let me know. I'd be glad to tell stories, anything. So let me know what kinds of things you would like to know about. I'm going to say now farewell. Thanks for joining me. If you've enjoyed the broadcast, please be sure to like it on Facebook and in YouTube, and to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and invite other people. Let other your Facebook friends, anybody that you know that likes travel at all, let them know that these events are happening, because I would like to have more visitors coming with us. But I'm just going to finish up by sending you this little video that I put together for after I'd done a hike in the Outer Hebrides. It was a beautiful day, and it is a very good example of what can happen when you're an independent traveler. So bye for now.
Thursday was a beautiful spring day here on Barra in the Outer Hebrides. That means the sun was shining and the wind was barely blowing, but the temperature was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so I still had to bundle up. I hiked along the west coast of the Isle of Barra completely alone in this sparse landscape. It was a short hike, only about 4 miles, but it took me the better part of 5 hours to do the walk. It was not difficult, but I just kept stopping to gawk at the incredible beauty around me. Moors, rocks, cliffs, and beach. The ocean wields its strength against the rocks and tears them down slowly, slowly. I am mesmerized by its determination, humbled by its power. My day ended at Tangasdale, a beach that rivals any in the South Seas in beauty and solitude. And of course, if all that is not enough, in the spring lambing season, you can always be entertained by the sweet lambs gamboling about. It was a wondrous day, and again, I had that feeling of disbelief in the life that I'm living now. How can one person be so fortunate?